basically the standing panel on impact assessment that appointed by the System Council, and so is basically facilitating and responsible for supporting impact assessment and rigorous production of evidence for the CGIAR. And Karen is a chair, and she is a professor at the Paris School of Economics and researcher at the French National Institute for Agricultural Research. And today she's telling us a little bit about SPIA and how SPIA is basically helping us to move forward with the impact assessment for initiative and for centers. So hopefully my introduction is good enough, Karen. Excellent. Is now up to you. Thanks a lot.
Great. All right. So thanks, Cristiano, and thanks also for the different discussions during the day. It's been interesting to hear the many things going on. I'm the chair. We have connected from Rome Ricardo Lahuarte and Mina Carasalo from the Secretariat who helped put the presentation together. So we've what I want to try to do is kind of just explain a little bit different things SPIA works on, so you kind of see both how some of the things we've been discussing fit in, but more generally I think it's important transparent about this and try to identify where are the commonalities, etc. And so as we are the way SPIA is organized is kind of, we have these 6-year work plans that cover the two of the business cycles of current CGIAR. We're in the second part of so we're in the middle of the second business cycle, which means that we will start to we're at the stage where we're starting to kind of obtain research findings and try to share and distribute those with the researchers in the system, but also with other stakeholders in the system, and including the funders, the System Council members more broadly. So in that work plan, there's 3 kind of pieces to that I'm going to talk about in reverse order. So there's kind of a part that has to do with capacity strengthening. There is a part that has to do with a portfolio of studies on learning accountability, and then the third part is something we started doing more recently, where we try to collect in a couple of priority countries to take a systematic look at the system level of the CGIAR. What are the innovations, broadly speaking, so technological and socioeconomic innovations that we expect to have reached a certain scale that we can measure it at the national level, and then work with the National Statistical Institutes to get these independent estimates of the CGIAR reach across the different systems. So let me explain that a bit better. So since kind of 2014, we've been working with in 4. So we started to work and now are working in 4 countries where the CGIAR has a long history of working, and where also many different centers and parts of the CGIAR kind of have worked for the last, let's say, 20 years. And we partner with the statistical agencies, and in the African countries also with the World Bank, the LSMS team of the World Bank. And so why do we do that? Is to kind of, in existing representative household surveys that are well institutionalized and therefore likely to continue also over time, we embed kind of measures of the CGIAR innovations in order to get not only kind of these independent measures, but to get them as part of a survey that allows to document what type of farmers are using those innovations, where those are those farmers, and whether it's the same type of farmers that use, for instance, an innovation from wild fish with some of the management practices on the crop side or with some of the institutional innovations, etc. Now, there's a data that gets generated through that process, which then can be used, of course, for many other questions. Okay, so this is a different way of looking at impact at the system level. So in the history of the CGIAR, the classical way of looking at the system level impacts was this idea of we calculate rates of return, which was very much focused on crops. Initially, and they said, okay, we're going to calculate the yield improvement on crop, and then we're going to multiply this with some measure of how many farmers are adopting that, and then we, multiply this and add it all up together, and then we have a rate of return. But in the new CGIAR, arguably that approach is not necessarily, I say new CGIAR, but even in the older CGIAR, arguably that approach had become a little. This data also allows us, and this is the power of having this in these national surveys, is to say, well, once you've built this in, then you can see who's using these innovations, right? So if we find gift tilapia, we not only knowing how many farmers, but is it the households with female managers versus male managers? Is it the young, the older, the people with the bigger ponds, the smaller farms, etc.? Basically, are we reaching the target, the targets that we're trying to reach? And so that's kind of the idea. And the idea was initially let's do this once, but then of course over time, as we both as the proof of concept is there, but also as we now have these kind of 20 timelines towards 2030, it then becomes interesting to say, and since we've built these into the panels, to say, okay, now this allows us also to go back after a number of years and see how this thing changed, right? So, and which then leads to this question of how do we institutionalize this? Building, the whole point of building on existing institutions was to kind of make this sustainable, and of course, it's kind of a more operational question around that. And so, how do we do this? So, in the 4 countries, we have a team mostly of pre-docs, and then under the leader, kind of boots on the ground, basically to help figure out what has happened. In terms of the innovations that are out there, kind of doing a lot of background research and also research on the measurement. And then, some of you know Frederick, who's not an early career researcher anymore, although I guess partly, and that team is being led by James, that many of you have, together with the panel. And so the first report that came out on this is that some of you may have seen is this work that we did in Ethiopia, where we, was basically the proof of concept, if you want to. Let's try to do this in one country where the CGIAR has worked for a long time. And so there in the survey, in the national level survey from 2018-19, we have a number we have 18 measures of 18 different innovations built in, and then use that to show evidence of large adoption across the science domain. So depending on how you calculate, you can calculate the lower bound of 4 million households using CGIAR innovations up to 11 million households as a higher bound, which is about 80% of the population of Ethiopia. So that's that's a high reach of the CGIAR. And the way you get to that is by looking at the different innovations together. But also what you find, and I'll show you this in the next slide, a kind of a very skewed distribution, right? So we find many innovations with low adoption and some with high adoption, right? And so that's exactly what we should expect, given that this is an innovation system and not everything is going to get scaled at the same time. So this data then, this is publicly available data, so then lots of other people can use it to do additional analysis, and including part of the idea is to say, well, if we have some of these innovations that have scaled, we can then target impact studies to them, and so some of that is ongoing. One of the other things we did is to, to make the data available and support some early career people to do follow-up work with the data. And then, as I hinted at, we then once these measures are in those surveys, the cost of continuing collection on that is relatively low, and so we have an update of that. The data is there, but not yet analyzed in terms of looking at the dynamics. And so the logic of this is kind of the following, right? So you have the universe of the CG research in Ethiopia over the last 20 years. You do a stock take of that based on the literature and lots of interviews. And in Ethiopia, that led to the identification of about basically 52 innovations that were believed to have beyond the pilot state, and 26 claims of policy. And so the color bar here indicate domains of the CGIAR that these innovations were in, and you see they're about equally distributed between crop, germplasm, animal agriculture, so that would include livestock, although of course in Ethiopia, the animal agriculture would include fishery, but of course in Ethiopia that's not necessarily very big, so the 52 are by Antepaleshe, 30 were the background research suggested that they would have scaled. And then we identified of those 30, basically 18 that we managed to integrate in the national level survey. A couple of others we purposely didn't include because they were already in other national surveys very recently. So, so notably wheat and beans are in that category. And then because CIAT and CIMET had done a study just the year before, so there's no point in duplicating things. And then a few that we left for inclusion in future waves, including kind of 1 or 2 that got included in 23. Okay. And so this is the skew distribution that I mentioned to you. So what this type of data allows to do is among other things, calculate for each of the innovations the potential reach. And so what this showed, kind of interestingly in Ethiopia, is that a lot of innovations haven't scaled, but a few have scaled a lot. So a few are reaching multiple millions of households. And interestingly enough, as it turns out in Ethiopia, the 3 highest categories are basically representative of the 3 domains of the CGIAR. So kind of there is a kind of an NRM part, kind of the crops, and then livestock. Okay, and so if you look at the system level, you get this wide adoption because this is moving quicker than I want. You get kind of some of these big gains, while a lot of the other ones are kind of smaller, but the synergies are there. You can also show that those 3 that are on top there, together with the 4th, which is kind of trees, are the ones where there has been kind of synergies between the biophysical research and the policy research. Okay, so we're doing something similar in Uganda, but let me for this audience, let me move quickly to this part of the world, or closer to this part of the world. So in Vietnam, we started working with the Statistical Institute in December 21. And we actually had a stakeholder workshop in June of 22, where we kind of with representatives of the government, obviously of the different CGIAR centers and different other like local researchers, etc., different stakeholders. And that was to kind of do the similar stock take. Actually, I'll show this first and then come back to the previous slide. So it's similarly starting to look at over the last 20 years, what are the innovations related to the CGIAR that have made it out in Vietnam, to a similar process of interviews and background literature. And in Vietnam, this led to again, a distribution of types of innovations, although not surprisingly in Vietnam with a bigger focus on NRM type of management type of questions, right? Crop germplasm is there, animal agriculture is there, and here now this includes indeed more substantially fishery innovations related to coming from world fish, including gift tilapia and some of the management practices. There's also a bunch of policy influence claims. And so once we narrow down to what is believed to have scaled, again, the distribution in fact gets more skewed, so even more of the NRM part is believed to have scaled. But you know, we've been having discussions on gift tilapia here, right? So the idea is we've identified those 21. Now, and so then we've been working with, or we are working with, GSO, the Statistical Institute, to build those into national level service. We've done this in 2 phases. In 2022, we had, so this year, based on what we agreed on last year, we had first 3 innovations that are basically on one NRM practice. So this is one kind of more policy, climate smart maps, so policy innovation, and then rice DNA fingerprinting, so crop varieties. And that was basically to do the proof of concept. And let's see whether, because here we're not working with the World Bank anymore, different model. Let's kind of start doing this at a relatively small scale, or for few innovations, if not a small scale, because it's a national level survey. And then this year, expanding towards both, so, you know, some improved measurements of the same things, but in particular, additional innovations, kind of getting closer to the 21 that I was thinking about, that I was mentioning. Okay, so then what is the ambition here is to kind of buy, so that data will be collected in 23, so that then by 24, having a report where we will do something similar as we did for Ethiopia, kind of showing for the different innovations that are out there, including hopefully gift tilapia and gift-derived tilapia. How many farmers are using those? Including what's the percentage of the farmers using aquaculture, or the tilapia farmers? There's different ways you can see this, and how does that relate to the other innovations? Link that with some of the more policy work, like for instance, been a lot of ideas on this climate smart maps, which is about helping governments, province level governments, adapt to climate adaptation. And then, you know, if we do find that the adoption of the gift is and the gift derived is still high enough, thinking through whether we can think through using the hollout data of that, you know, that's to be determined to do an impact study. Okay. And then Bangladesh is the one that we started the most recently. Where we have a postdoc that started working a few months ago, and so basically we'll follow a similar logic, but you know, since we only started more recently with the stock take, I can't show you a similar figure. The note though that here also, I mean, from what we know is that, you know, not surprisingly, you know, the climate adaptation part and the flood resilience part in particular will be relevant for the Bangladesh work, but also again the aquaculture and you know, building on some of the work that you guys did in terms of documenting earlier the rollout, etc. So part of this work relates to. Sorry, one more thing on this. So I mentioned this quickly. So kind of part of the idea is here to say, well, not only, you know, one adoption, one innovation at a time, but also to what extent do we see that those farmers, coming back to our discussion, those farmers that are using certain types of varieties, are they the same farmers that are using certain practices or management practices, and do we see kind of a divergence there? So across this all work, there is kind of questions on how to improve measurements. So the work around DNA fingerprinting fits to that, right? So that's something where over the years there's been lots of learning and how we do this, including guidance on the crop side at least, that you know, that can now be shared, that has been written up, that is shared with others, that can, so that more and more people can start using that type of data. And so similarly, for some of the other work in Vietnam, we're kind of thinking through different ways of measuring, also on the NRM side. So on the NRM side, we're talking about practices, so it's harder to get an objective measure. But also it's harder to even get for some of the practice, and I think the same is going to be true in aquaculture. And arguably, we're not necessarily interested in the practice alone, but kind of more in the principle, right? So there's certain kind of principles of management that you want to expect. So let me give an example. In Vietnam, so the government, with the support of IRI, has been kind of promoting this what they call one must do 5 reductions. So you must use certified seed, and then you need to reduce fertilizer use, pesticide use, storage losses, etc. And so that's a principle, right? So and so then how do we measure that is an empirical question. And so that's what we're trying to address through some qualitative, quantitative approaches, coming up with an instrument that sees whether people are using that principle to go to a more sustainable method.